The presentation is PinPadPwn, and we'll talk a little bit about payment terminal hacking today. So we'll start off with an introduction into payment terminals, and then more specifically Chipandpin, which is used in the UK for payments at payment terminals. We look a bit into EMV, which is the protocol that is used during Chipandpin payments, and then we look at a few case studies with demos of 3 devices that we had a poke at, and we'll end with a conclusion. Let's start off with the introduction. I'm Nils. I'm the head of research at MWR. I won the Pound-to-Own competition in 2009 and 2010, and most recently I've been doing a lot of Android research before I had a look at the payment terminals. My colleague Rafael unfortunately can't be here to join me for the presentation, but with all of the research that I'm going to present, we did the research into that together, so just as much credits to him for doing this research. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here today. So why did we decide to do the research into payment terminals? Well, first of all, it turns out there isn't as much money in Android exploits as we thought, so payment terminals was an obvious choice. They are very, very widely used. There are hundreds of billions of transactions made through payment terminals every month. And they are the main entry point for payment information, so everything that is used to handle the payment gets into the payment terminal first, so it's a very interesting target for criminals to get their hands on. From the merchant's perspective, they are the only way for the merchant to see payment has been authorized and to see whether the money should be on the bank for the merchant. The merchant has no other way of confirming that than what the payment terminal tells the merchant. So also interesting again for criminals who would like to authorize payments without actual money going out their bank account. And the recent payment terminals have become more and more powerful. Some of these terminals have a huge attack surface. They can play videos, they show advertisement in the shop and that sort of stuff. So they are fairly likely to be vulnerable. And a payment terminal, both for the merchant and for the card holder, is single failure. Everything has to go through a payment terminal when you do card payments. So previous attacks that we have seen in the wild mostly were around skimming. So skimmers build 4 terminals, and that involve modifying the hardware so that, similar to ATM skimmers, so that they gather data. We have seen, most of the skimmers we have seen will gather data of the magnetic stripe, but some of them we have seen also will do the same from the smart card, so for chip and pin payments, and some newer skimming attacks against payment terminals use the smart card interface to gather the pin as well. We have seen attacks where just the terminals were completely replaced by fake terminals, where the only purpose was to gather data. So that's what we have seen. Not a very sophisticated attack, but seemingly it works. And also what we have seen a bit happening is manipulated applications. So usually you have an insider, someone who develops applications for these devices, and these guys will modify the application so that it will gather data from the payment terminal, maybe authorize payments and so on. There's an interesting paper by MasterCard. You can get it from the MasterCard website, and the paper is called Understanding Terminal Manipulation at the Point of Sale. And that paper lies out previous attacks that MasterCard has seen against payment terminals. So actual attacks that have happened in the world, and very interesting read. One of the examples of what is happening out there, this was a posting on one of the freelancer forums on the internet, and this guy is basically saying, I need someone who can modify a Verifone BX670, one of the very common payment terminals, so that it will record track 1, track 2, and pin, and also that if you attempt a chip and pin payment, that it will fall back to magstripe payments, and then instead try to get the user to swipe the magstripe And also, he uses sentences like, this will be a dummy machine, if you know what that means. So apparently there's some kind of organized way of, with their own terminology around these kind of attacks. And obviously this is, he's only paying $3,000 for this, so it's not very expensive to do that. That should be something like £1,000 at the moment. So when we looked at payment terminals, our background is in software security. So we were mostly interested in the attack surface of the applications and the operating system running on these payment terminals. And basically we found that these payment terminals are small computers. On top of their mostly custom operating system, they run payment applications. You have different levels of payment applications. There can be separation between these payment applications. And you won't be surprised to hear that there are the same vulnerabilities that you find in mobile phones and PCs as well. The attack surface pretty much depends on the kind of terminal that you're having, but you'll see things like magnetic stripe, most obvious one. It's really hard to get a lot of data into the magnetic stripe functions though, because of the physical limitations. Chipandpin, where you're basically just limited on how much data you can get in there by how much you pay for the smart card that you're developing with. All sorts of communications are going on. A lot of these payment terminals talk directly to the payment provider, so you will get Ethernet connections, modem, so telephone line connections, wireless connections. We have payment terminals in the office that connect through Wi-Fi or Bluetooth to a communication network. The most commonly what you see is them being directly connected through the serial port to a POS system, and the POS system then instructing the payment terminal to do its operation. There were some instances where you have JTAG enabled on a payment terminal. We have not seen one of those, and we weren't tampering with the payment terminal itself. We approached all of the research from a pure software perspective. And then the obvious attack surface is the setup menu. So all of these devices have some sort of configuration options, and you can, by putting in specific combinations on the payment terminals, get into the setup menus. Usually you will be asked for a password, but that's usually the default password, which you can Google as well. Our research approach was as follows. We had the goal of finding and exploiting software vulnerabilities. And that was the main goal of the whole research, so that we can demonstrate that these terminals are vulnerable, just as other computer systems are. We approached the research from a complete black box perspective. So what we could have done is try to get hold of the SDK of these payment terminal manufacturers, but that would require us to sign up for an NDA, and then obviously we wouldn't be able to present here. Now it's also very, very expensive to sign up as a developer for these kind of payment terminals. So that's a good way of getting money for the payment terminal manufacturers as well. If you sign up for the SDK, you have to make a lot of training courses. These training courses are very expensive and so on. So what we did, we used the information that was available on Google already. And the payment terminals we bought off of auction sites such as eBay, and other providers, which might have been some people we met in a car park, which had lots of payment terminals. All of the payment terminals that we bought were second-hand terminals that have been used in shops before, and that was quite important for us because these terminals usually have the payment application installed. If you get a completely new terminal, it won't run a payment application. It will have the operating system on there, but there's not much you can do with it. You have to install the payment application so that it does something useful. All of the ones you find on eBay, they will have the payment application installed that will have been used in the shop, and they are also set up in the same setup as in a shop. So you will find all the configuration data, like the merchant ID, the merchant's credentials to sign up with the payment providers. I'm pretty certain that if we would connect some of these terminals up to a network, that we could authorize refunds through the payment terminal, because they are set up in the same way, and you just need to hook them up either to the telephone line or to Ethernet network in most cases, and then you would be able to do all kinds of stuff. Obviously, that wasn't an option for us to connect someone else's payment terminals to talk to the payment provider. So, so that was not part of the research. Our lab for the payment terminals looks something like this. And if you have a look around in the UK, so this is actually a very good representation of the kind of payment terminals that you see in the shops. I reckon with this setup that we would cover around 70 to 80% of the payment terminals used today in UK shops, just by looking at the terminals that were on eBay. And to be fair, if you want to look into payment terminals, some of these, for example, this one, I'm going to do a demonstration on later. That was £4.20 on eBay, set up with all the configuration data. I think that was used in a beauty salon. So yeah, you can have a lot of fun just by poking around with these terminals. So there are several common setups which you will find for the payment terminals. The really basic one is just a dump terminal, and this dump terminal won't have an application and receives all of the instructions from the POS system, and the POS system would do things like display enter pin and then show me what the user type and then do that and then read that off the smart card. So it's very dumb. And the ones we looked at were terminals that have their own payment applications. These payment applications either come directly from the payment terminal vendor, often with some modifications to be used with a certain payment provider. So the software actually from the vendor goes out to other parties that are developing applications that are just slightly modifying their application. But you also get applications that are completely written by third parties. For example, if you have payment terminals used in a chain of a lot of shops, for them it makes sense to develop their own application for their own needs and have their own developers for these payment applications. And then, yeah, so the two connectivity options of the more intelligent payment terminals is basically it connects to internal systems, whether that is another POS system or their own payment transaction system. But usually it directly connects to either through the phone line or through the internet to a payment provider, which can be a bank or a specialized company for doing payments. So basically, what the ecosystem then looks like is usually the manufacturer of the payment terminals provides the terminals to the acquirer who is processing the payments, and that acquirer sets up the terminal, sets it up to connect to their payment systems, and then maybe does some modification to the software and then gives it to the retailer where it is used in the shop. But what you can also get is that the manufacturer just gives the SDK and the cert, charging a lot of money for that at the same time, to a developer, and then the developer will go ahead and produce their own applications. And the other terminal I've got here is an example where this route was taken for an acquirer. So an acquirer has special requirements for the payment application, and that will be a completely custom application. And then it's given to the retailer. What you see more recently quite commonly is also that the manufacturer is directly providing payment terminals to the retailer, and that has mostly happened because especially one of the manufacturers has bought up most of the market for payment terminals, including payment providers, so they can provide everything from in-house. The most interesting attack surface, especially in the UK where we have chip-and-pin payments, is the chip-and-pin attack surface. Chip-and-pin itself is a major improvement over MagStripe. Now you have some sort of ways of authenticating the payment more intelligently. It is very widely implemented in Europe, Canada, most of Asia, not so much in the US though, and they are a bit slow in picking up on these developments. And yeah, the chip basically allows for better user authentication. You have room for far more static data, so certificates and the sort on these chip and pin on the smart cards. and most of the newer generation of Chipandpin cards, which should be all of the ones in the UK produced since 2009, can do actual crypto operation to sign the payments, and you will actually get a cryptogram which states the exact details of the payment, and that's sent off to the payment provider, and they will have a copy, and the retailer should have a copy. The PIN in this case will replace where previously was used a signature or an ID to approve the payment. So the cardholder has to remember their PIN, and the PIN is actually a proof that the cardholder has authorized the payment. So and for banks this is convenient because they can say either this payment has been approved by the user or the user was careless with their PIN. That is, if actually there are no other ways of getting hold of the PIN. Just a very brief introduction to smart cards. A smart card, when plugged into a device, it's powered on by the device, and the first thing it sends back to the device is the so-called answer to reset, which details what kind of protocols the smart card speaks, what kind of smart card it is. And then all the communication after that is done with application protocol data units. And it's always at the host system, so the system that is talking to the smart card is always sending requests to the smart card, and the smart card only ever responds to these requests. So there's no way that the smart card can initiate communication. It is always just responding to requests. Especially in EMV, they have some hacks around sending a request to tell the smart card to tell back what the next request should be, and that sort of thing. So hacks around getting to get around of this model, but usually it's just request by the host, response by the smart card. EMV is a protocol, the de facto standard for making payments with smart cards. It's short for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. It's used for all of the major card brands, and also is commonly used for gift cards. Sometimes used for bus pass, where you have smart cards. Also really interesting for us is that contactless payments usually use EMV for the communication as well. So contactless just replaces the chip connectors and says, oh, we're talking just the same protocol over wireless now, that's fine, without considering the implications of wireless. And it defines such aspects as multiple card applications. So actually, from the standard, you can have one card, which is a Visa card and a MasterCard at the same time, and it's up to the payment terminal to decide which smart card application it uses to accept the next payment. You get that quite commonly where you have chip and PIN cards, which are used in countries. So, for example, in Germany, the most common system is EC, which is specific to Germany. But you will often get cards which implement EC and Visa, so that you can use the same card for payments in Germany and for payments outside of Germany. They store a lot of data. So they store the expiry date. They don't store the PIN. That should be the account number. That is stored just in data structures on the smart card and can be retrieved by the payment terminals, card holder name, all these sort of things. And they also handle the PIN verification. The PIN verification, in most cases, will just be payment terminal saying, here's the PIN, and the card responding back with yes, that's the correct PIN, or no, that's the wrong PIN, or you only have one try left, or you have used up all of your attempts. A really useful resource is EMV Lab Doc, where you can see what data structures can be stored on smart cards and an introduction into EMV as a protocol and so on. An example for EMV records, so the records in EMV store the data on the card, which can then be retrieved again. This is an example. You have basically nested TLV structures, so TLV being tag length value. And TLV we have seen in other network protocols as well, especially where ASN1 is used, and we know that there are a lot of problems with parsing TLV protocols. As you would expect if you have a data structure which can hold more data, but specify another value for the length of the data. So there's a lot of fun to be had with the EMV parsing. Really good book, and that helped me to implement the smart cards, which pretend to be payment cards for my demonstrations. So implementing electronic card payment system that goes very practically through all the steps that are required to implement a payment terminal or to implement a smart card to do payments. And if you want to produce your own malicious smart cards, that's a perfect introduction for us. Now let's see how we approach the testing of EMV. Our first attempt was a man-in-the-middle smart card sniffing device, which is usually used for SAT-TV hacking. And that basically sits between, you insert it into the terminal and then you insert the smart card into this little device. And that allows you to sniff the data through a serial interface. However, we got fairly mixed results with that. So with some of the payment terminals, it worked fine. With some others, it didn't work at all. And also, it doesn't allow you to change any of the communication. So it's not perfect. There's other hardware out there which we weren't able to get hold of yet, the so-called smart card detective, and that's far more flexible. However, it's really hard to get your hands on one of those. Now, after that first attempt failed, we went on and looked at other ways of doing this. And we created a smart card which can do all of that for us. So this smart card, it's a custom-built smart card, will log all the requests sent to the smart card, and it will also be programmable by us to respond to specific requests in a specific way. For the implementation, we use basic cards. I don't know whether any one of you had experience with Java cards or ever managed to set a Java card development environment up, but it's a real pain to do that. So basic cards is just a well-integrated development environment that everything just works fine. They are cheap, easy to get, so we use that. And basically what our device now can do is we insert our custom-built smart card into a payment terminal or any device basically which accepts smart cards. And the smart card will record all of the communication that takes place, and then we insert it into our computer, and the computer retrieves the log of the communication that has taken place on the device, and then we replay back the request sent to the smart card to an actual card for the system, so a payment card in this example. And then the computer logs the responses of the actual card and can reprogram back the responses to our card, and then we can just run through this, put it back into the payment terminal. We get a little deeper down into the protocol. So it involves a lot of physical switching between these devices, but in the end, so to get to the stage where you enter your PIN, for example, that's about 24 communications in most payment terminals and payment cards. So that's well doable and a flexible way as well. And you can work with systems that prevent non-smart cards to be inserted, like ATMs, for example, wouldn't like cables attached to the device that you insert into the ATM. And this smart card works well with ATMs, for example. Now let's look at some of the findings that we got using this technique. We have 3 case studies. 2 will hopefully be working live demos, and another one is a recorded demo on 3 different terminals. The vulnerabilities are currently with the vendors, and they are working on the patches for the vulnerabilities. We won't show any vendor names, just because we don't want to single out a single vendor. We think that other vendors will have similar problems. However, we just got lucky on these devices, and that's why we do the demonstration on these devices. That doesn't mean that these devices are any worse than the devices of other vendors. And unfortunately, because the vendors are currently in the process of creating the patches, and there are no patches out there, we can't talk about specifics of the vulnerabilities, but I don't think that's a huge loss for the presentation. First terminal we looked at, that's this one. If you, for example, like your coffee from the coffee shop around the corner on every corner, that's the terminal you would use to make payments. And actually, you would use a very similar application to this application as well. So that terminal is usually connected through Ethernet or through a phone line to a third-party payment provider. The payment provider actually has been bought up by the company that produces the payment terminal. The first crash we got into the terminal was actually through the network interface. And back then we posted this picture on Twitter as well. And that shows you a couple of interesting information. So basically we took the network protocol, did a bit of manual fuzzing, if you can call that, with the protocol. And suddenly we got AAAAA in the program counter of the device. And from this screenshot we can tell several things. First of all, we can make a good guess of what the architecture is. ARM. These are ARM registers, so we know that. We see what the program counter was on which it crashed. We see the link register, which is now not massively useful for us at the moment because we don't know anything else of the memory layout. However, if we go further into exploitation, for example, we would know where the binary is located. And by triggering the crash all over again, is that better? Okay, I'll try this. That's going to be interesting with the demos. So you can tell where the binary is located by repeating the crash. You can tell that there's no ASLR in place on this device, which will be useful for the exploitation as well. And you see the address it crashed on. Not in the case where it crashes on a wrong program counter, but in any other cases where you can trigger a crash, you will see what the address was that it tried to access while crashing. And using this information, and the vulnerability we found was a very flexible vulnerability. So we were able to get a lot of data in. We almost had no limitations on what kind of characters we can use. There was a stack-based buffer overflow, and that allowed us to do a kind of manual memory dump. And you see some parts of the manual memory dump here just by crashing the application. Take a note of the crash, for example. First thing that we did was send a lot of data, and then suddenly it won't crash with an invalid program counter, but it will crash while it is hitting the end of the stack. So now we know where the stack is. We know where our payload will be. We can start executing instructions. We know that it is ARM architecture, so we do know what kind of instructions to execute, and then you would start off looking at executing instructions which will dereference stuff from inside the memory, maybe at the link register address, to see what kind of bytes are located there. And then you can continue slowly with that to eventually dump out a lot of the memory of the device and start writing your shellcode from that. This then allowed us to develop a payload which allowed us to retrieve back the binary which is executed, the main binary, around the link register, and start reversing of that binary in IDA. And that then allowed us to find a lot more vulnerabilities. And also to get an idea of how system calls work on these kind of devices, even at all to get an idea that they have separation between the kernel and the applications running on there, and that sort of thing. And it also allowed us to find more weaknesses. Most notable that it uses hard-coded passwords, like actual hard-coded passwords, something that you can't change. In IDA, it's quite easy to see. You see the password check function. If that fails, it just falls back to another check against a static value, which is interesting. And also to find Chipandpin vulnerabilities, one of which I will demonstrate in the next demonstration. So the one Chipandpin vulnerability we have found in this terminal is a fairly straightforward stack-based buffer overflow during the handling of EMV tags that are sent to the device early on in the communication protocol. And it allows for arbitrary code execution, fairly similar to the network vulnerability that we found initially. Because of the limitations of the EMV data structures, especially the length limitations, we had to have multiple stages. First one was using return-oriented programming to retrieve more data from the card. This data we can then execute, and then we can basically repeat getting more data from the card to build our final payload, and basically have an indefinite amount of payload to be executed. And the payload that you will see in the next demo is 870 bytes in total. So that's something like 435 ARM thumb instructions for the demonstration, and we switch to the right. So that's the device here on the desk. We have to log in as a merchant first. So all of that was hard-coded on the device when we got it from eBay as well, merchant passwords and so on. But you can Google for them as well. They are the default ones, and most people don't really change passwords anyway. We start a new transaction as you would do in the shop. It now tries to connect to the network, so it tries to connect to the payment provider, which will fail because it's not connected to a network. And then we can fall back to accept an offline payment. So without live authentication of the user's chip and PIN card. Most systems will do that in case you have a network outage or anything like that, so that you can still accept payments. So we do an offline payment, start the transaction, put in a value for the transaction, hit enter, reference number for the transaction is required here. And then it asks us to insert or swipe a card. And for this specific demonstration, we have created this card. Can anyone tell what picture that is? Yeah, outrun, that's correct. And you'll see why we used this specific one. So now you walk up into the shop, pretend to make a payment with this card. Probably you would print something different on the card, and then it reads the data from the card and starts a racing game on the device. And the best bit, I don't know whether you can see that here, it prints out the score each time you crash the car. And you can restart and try again. We plan to have that at our stand upstairs later and see who can get the highest high score. My best is 401, which is pretty good. A friend of mine made 715, and I was wondering whether we can maybe beat him here. So basically, crowdsource a better score. And we will have the proof because it's printed on the receipt as well. So that's very handy. So this, the demonstration is good fun, but it mostly demonstrates two things. First of all, that we can get control over the payment terminal, that we can execute arbitrary code on the terminal, we can change the screen content, and we can change what is printed out on the receipt. So that is enough for the merchant to believe that a payment has processed by printing a valid receipt and saying, PIN verified on the screen. We now would be able to go ahead and validate payments without even contacting the payment providers, without writing any logs to the device. So the merchant wouldn't even know that this is going on. The vulnerability has been reported to the vendor, and I think they are working on a fix. However, yeah, as I said, anything can be done. So, for example, authorized payments. And we will have a financially more interesting payload later on as well. So the second case study we did on the device, which is very... So you'll find it in the UK at some locations. However, it's very popular in the US. It's used in the taxis, and actually in most shops, it's either this or the competitor's device is used in almost all of the shops. This can accept signatures on the device itself, that's why it is interesting. But more interesting for us, it's a quite capable device which can display advertisement and all sorts of things. So it has a much different attack surface to the other devices we have been looking at. It's, again, an ARM processor. The operating system is embedded Linux. Which is great. BusyBox is pre-installed. GDB server is pre-installed, so it couldn't be easier to attack a device like this. Has a full color screen, touch screen, and so on. Looking at the attack surface, we again have smart cards, SIM cards in case you set it up to connect to the payment providers through the mobile network. Magnetic card, obviously, because it's used in the US. Some of them have additional devices which accept contactless payments. You have a USB interface, Ethernet interface, serial interface, so a lot of options to attack these terminals. And the security features, and I haven't mentioned that in the previous, so there are some requirements to make these payment terminals PCI compliant. I said that in a presentation, that's not great. So they require binary signing for the binaries that are uploaded to the device, and they're supposed to verify these binary against certs that are pre-installed on the device. And all of these devices have pretty good tamper protection as well. So if you drop one off the table, it will probably reset and not boot up again and say the device has been tampered with, so you can't use it anymore. So the hardware protection actually don't seem to be too bad. Now the payment application is a built-in terminal application which is written by the vendor. And has all kinds of functionality for displaying adverts. It has a remote administrative interface, so you can log in through your web browser into this interface and manage all your terminals for all the shops that you have. Requires internet access, obviously, to do that. Just by looking at these payment terminals, it's notably different to all the other payment terminals. So most of the communication that goes on is not encrypted. You can easily modify this communication, and once you can do that and you have an underlying Linux system, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. For this one, I don't have a live demo, but I've got a recording of the demo that we did in the office. So basically, this is the device. It's booting up. Can't see a vendor name there. And while it is booting up, it's now booting up the Linux system, everything. And as soon as it has booted up, it tries to connect to this remote administration server. And you can easily intercept that communication. It doesn't use SSL. So you can modify all the communication with that. And we found some flaws which are more down to, we found some features which can be used to modify this terminal if you're able to intercept the communication. Booting up takes a little while. So what you now see here, it's trying to connect to the remote administrative interface. The video is not perfect, but I hope you can see that we are now starting our server, which will accept the communication from the device. And then the device will start communicating with our server, and it will wait for a download of a new application from the server. So the download, if you legitimately supply a download, that would require the download again to be signed and verified against certificates. So we use a different way and to upload our own application. And it turns out the Linux system, if you execute binaries from the Linux system directly, that doesn't require any certificate on the binary. And what you have also seen towards the end of the video is that we enabled a telnet server which is pre-installed on these devices, and we can now log in with root into the device and do all sorts of things with the device. Actually, you can get that fairly cheap from eBay. It might be a cheap option. Instead of a Raspberry Pi, you get one of these devices. So what we have shown is we have now fully compromised the device, have root access to the device. All of the requirements for binary signing are just enforced on the binaries that are uploaded through the legitimate interfaces. However, once you got access to the system, you can run unsigned applications as well. You can change the root password to an empty password and then enable telnet to log into the devices. Third case study, again, a device which is very commonly used in the UK especially. This device and the handheld version of the device both are used a lot in pubs and restaurants, for example. And this device comes, same operating system as in the first demonstration. So the first one was a little bit older device. This one is a newer one. Let me just boot that up so that we don't have to do that later. and we did understand the operating system already, so that makes things easy for the research into this device, because we know how a payload would look like that we execute on the device as well. And we know stuff about the memory layout and so on, so we don't have to bother much about that. The same application is used on multiple different devices, and it's the default application by the vendor with slight modifications by the payment provider. The code quality we found to be considerably better than in the first device, so it didn't fall over immediately once we changed some bytes. However, we were still able to find vulnerabilities deeper down in the protocol, in the EMV protocol. Again, we found default and hard-coded credentials once we got access to the binary on these devices. Best one is the super mega password, which allows you to override any password screen on the device. You can disable that password, but I've not seen a single device where this super mega password is disabled. So that's our third demonstration then. So device booted up is in the default state now and ready to accept payments as well. The first card will trigger the bug that we have found, and it will actually now modify the device so that it will do something for us. I don't know whether you can see it. That's the card that we used. No, that's the second card. That's the first card. So the idea is this is the card of Tinkerbell who puts the pixie dust into the device. We insert the card, and this will automatically start a payment as well. So it goes to the sales screen. The merchant would put in an amount for the payment. So actually you see, so the data we are supplying up there, EMV Labs, that would usually show Visa or MasterCard or anything like that. We are supplying that with the card. The account number is obviously fake with a 1337 in there. So that can be all supplied by our fake card. And now we start the payment. And it'll just say card error and nothing else. It's printed out as a receipt. However, what the merchant at this point doesn't know is that we have modified the terminal so that it, from now on, will intercept any legitimate payments. So we've got a legitimate Visa payment card here for Mr. Nils. And we can use this card now. So the idea is the criminal walks into the shop first day in the morning, infects the payment terminal, and from now on, during all the payments throughout the day, card numbers and PIN numbers will be recorded in the shop. So anyone who walks into the shop, makes a payment, a legitimate payment this time, that starts the payment process. Again, same as we have previously seen. Please wait. This sounds better. So it starts the payment. You can't see the credit card number. We put in an amount. Wait. That's better. It's a prepaid card, $10 US prepaid cards. We put in an amount for the payment, and then it asks us to enter the PIN. Obviously, if we go into the shop, we will shield that PIN, because it would be really stupid to give away PIN and card number. And now it tries to connect to the payment provider through a dial-up connection. In this case, it will fail again. This device doesn't support offline payments, so the payment processing will fail. It tries to dial again, and it will store the failed attempt. Print out a receipt again with my card number. And we don't print a customer receipt. However, this payment has failed. It would go through as it usually would if it is connected to a phone line. At this point, the terminal has recorded this payment and has stored the card number and the PIN number on the device. And you can do multiple payments throughout the day, and at the end of the day, our criminal comes back with Winnie the Pooh, who retrieves the honey, and the honey in this case being the card numbers and PIN numbers from the device. Again, start the terminal, start a transaction. This device is still modified by us. So instead of doing a valid transaction, we start off in a transaction. And actually, in this case, you see that it authorized the payment without even asking for a PIN. Because we now have full control over the device, that's another thing that we can do, which is fairly handy as well. So fake receipt, the receipt says that in this case, we didn't have to do any cardholder verification, and it approved the payment. So that's another thing that we can do. However, more interestingly, on this card, we now have the card numbers and the PIN numbers that were recorded from all the payments that happened throughout the day. And so the criminal could now walk back to his PC and put the card into the card reader. And in this example, we have the CashInHide, which hides most of the card number and the PIN number. I've got another script which doesn't hide it, and you just have to believe that that is the case. So we take our Winnie the Pooh card, there, the Winnie the Pooh card, plug it into the card reader, and then we can execute our CashInHide script, and that retrieves the logs from the device, and we see parts of the card number and the PIN number, well, one digit of the PIN number in this case, which were recorded off of the device. Now, obviously, as a payload, that wouldn't be, and so people that have stakes in card payments will immediately tell you, oh, you can't use the card number and the PIN number to authorize payments, so there's no real flaw in the system, so you can't do anything useful. Probably the most likely thing that a criminal would want to do in this case is, for every 10th payment, say that there was a chip error during a valid payment, and ask the merchant to use the magnetic stripe instead. And now you have the PIN number and the magnetic stripe, and we know that we can use that to make transactions at ATMs in foreign countries. So that would be a valid attack again. We reported it to the vendor in the beginning of July, and a patch is already existing according to the vendors. We had no ways of verifying that. However, they were very responsive, very interested in the details of the vulnerabilities, and very good at handling this case. However, the only problem with that, and with the whole payment terminal infrastructure for this, is it will take ages to get to all of the devices. And most likely, most of these devices will never update just for a security reason, because it involves quite a big change to the devices. I've seen devices, for example, the device used in the first demonstration that has online update capabilities in the third-party application, which is great, because then you can fix issues like this immediately without any real cost to the end user. On these devices, it's fairly unlikely for the patches to ever make it to most of the devices. Now looking at future work, so that was our initial research into payment terminals, and we demonstrated that we can get code execution on these devices, and we can exploit these devices just as we can do with other computer systems. From a perspective of future work, what I'm immediately interested in is more details of the operating system. How is that implemented? How well is it implemented? Can we have privilege escalation exploits? And we know how the system calls work through the reversing of the application that we did. So the next step would be looking at the implementation of the system calls. What can we do to escalate our privilege into the kernel? How do firmware updates work? So there are firmware updates. You can find firmware updates for these devices on the internet. However, I found no way of decrypting. Well, it seems to be encrypted. It could just be well encoded or compressed. But I found no way of doing that. And doing the next step into the kernel hopefully will also help to have a look at the firmware update process and to get maybe to a point where we can check just the firmware updates for security vulnerabilities without going through the whole steps of manually trying to get code execution on the devices. There are a lot of other attack surfaces which we haven't looked at. they have a common, they have their own Wi-Fi drivers, Bluetooth drivers. The network stack is implemented in user mode as a library in the applications. So that is part of the applications. Probably very interesting to look at. So in the user mode, you get it ICMP implementation, TCP implementation, UDP implementation, a lot of stuff which could be interesting to attack these devices. And currently in all of the demonstrations, apart from the one on the Linux device, we were able to modify the device while it was running. However, we weren't able to modify the applications on there because during a reboot, it will again check the certificates and the signatures of the binaries, and then will fail to boot up. So there's no direct way of getting persistence on the device, but we have some ideas around maybe changing configuration files, trigger bugs in the parsing of configuration files to gain code execution back on the reboot of the device. Or maybe there are other ways. It could be that there are binaries loaded during runtime which are not checked, and so on. And then obviously, which basically NFC, if you have the EMV vulnerabilities, you just would need a device that accepts NFC payments, and it probably uses the same EMV implementation for parsing that. So probably you could directly translate these demonstrations to NFC-enabled devices. However, they are harder to get hold on eBay. So conclusion of this is there's a lot of trust into these payment terminals, and maybe this trust isn't justified. The cardholder puts in the PIN number, the card which is used for payments into the device, and then completely trusts the device. And at the same time, the merchant also trusts the device to tell them whether a payment has been authorized, and then happily gives away stuff for just because the payment terminal said that it processed the payment. And if the payment terminal is modified through an exploit, for example, this could not even communicate with the payment provider and just print out valid receipts instead. There has been a lot of effort into the physical security of these devices. So if you open up one of these devices, you will find a lot of tamper-proof shielding, protections against probes on the PinPad entry field, and that sort of thing. However, we didn't find the same kind of protections on the software level and on the software security level. So we have seen vulnerabilities which we were used to see maybe 15 years ago in the PC market. Really basic stack-based buffer overflows while handling user-controlled input, really basic memory corruption issues, and in the case of the second demonstration, straight code injection. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned near the start with the EMV data structures that the PIN verification can be done directly from the card without any sort of interaction over the network. Does that open up any sort of fun with cracking pins based on having physical access to the card, or is there some sort of protection mechanism inside the chip itself that prevents you from just trying, all 10,000 pins on a 4-digit?
So the protection is the limitation on password attempts, and that will be implemented in the smart card. You usually get something like 3 attempts, and afterwards it will just deny any attempt to make a PIN verification. It would be interesting to look at software vulnerabilities in the smart cards to see whether there are any ways around that. However, so the protections against this are in place. One interesting attack which the guys from Cambridge University did was, and they wrote this paper, Chipandpin is broken, and they basically used a card which is combined with another valid card which has been stolen, and they intercept the communication, and for each attempt to do a PIN verification, it will say, yes, that's the correct PIN. And there you see that the smart card is not actually, so if I would think about how I implement this, I would make it so that the PIN verification changes the state of the smart card so that it, after that, only will create cryptograms for payments and so on. However, that's not the case. The PIN verification is completely separate with that. The smart card doesn't care whether it authorizes a payment and whether there has been a valid PIN before authorizing this payment. So there are obvious flaws in the EMV protocol, which allows you to use a stolen card with another device in the middle, which says yes to every PIN, and then you can authorize payments that way. Any other questions? Back there?
Yeah. At what point in the EMV transaction did you inject your payload from the card?
Well, without giving too much away for the vulnerability in terms of vulnerabilities, first demonstration was during the reading of the EMV data records. So really straightforward. Probably the first thing that you would attempt. And the second required to put in specific data structures to get it into a state where it processes some of the data structures later on in the transaction, and then falls over on processing the cards. Far deeper down the protocol, the book I showed earlier came in really handy to get even to that state where this vulnerability was triggered, and simple just modification of the EMV data structures didn't even lead. Well, it did lead to one not exploitable crash, but so the quality was notably the software quality was notably different in the second device, and it's fairly deep down the protocol. Any other? Yeah. We'll wait for the microphone.
The CV2 number on the back of the card can be retrieved by the terminal?
No. So the CV2 number, which you would use to make online as in internet payments, that one is not stored, and it would be quite a flaw if that would be stored in the EMV data records. But it's not stored in there, so you can't just go and grab that while the payment is processed. That would be very nice and easy. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.